Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Tangley. I'm the Vice Chair and Treasurer. I have the luxury of holding two roles within the American Politics Group, although I'm not sure it is a luxury, but there we go. And I work for the University of Portsmouth. And I'm really pleased to be sitting on a panel, or chairing a panel that I've got a lot of interest in. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to thank Laura for her hard work, having started this series of ECR events back in 2018, which seems like a very lifetime ago now. I know the hard work that goes into these events, so well done, and thank you for allowing me to come along and participate. I really enjoyed today. So first up is Dr. Alin Barbantan, who specialises in US Indo-Pacific foreign policy, both before and after the Cold War, and his main topic of interest are US alliances, strategic culture, and burden sharing. And his paper is Can the Pacific Dream Prevail? The Strategic Culture of Trump and Biden Compared. All right.
Thanks.
Okay, over to you.
Yeah, so hi everyone. So this paper is based on a draft journal article I'm writing, which takes from like 2 chapters of my PhD thesis. I'm analyzing the changes in US strategic culture by comparing foreign policies of Trump and Biden in the Indo-Pacific area. So the article is structured roughly in the following manner. I'll have an introduction of what the Pacific Dream is, a literature review section, an overview of US-China relations to both the Trump and Biden presidencies, and then I move on to the San Francisco system. San Francisco system, sometimes known as the hub and spoke system, is essentially a post-World War II network of American bilateral alliances in the Indo-Pacific. It consists of the US, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand. For better or for worse, since the end of the Cold War, the San Francisco system is the most enduring feature of American alliance strategy in Asia, but it also has this loose bilateral structure, which raises the question, can it face contemporary challenges? So when I designed the San Francisco system section, I've made subsections for all 5 treaty allies, and I analyzed how the relationship with the US has evolved for all of them. And because one of the underlying points of my thesis is that the San Francisco system is not accurately suited for geopolitical realities of the Indo-Pacific, I've given space to a third section, which is for the Quad. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad as it's known informally, is a platform consisting of the US, Japan, Australia, and India. It first emerged in the mid to late 2000s, but it was gone by the time Obama came into office. It re-emerged in full during the later Trump years. And my argument here is that the Quad is slowly supplanting the San Francisco system. So this is like the opening rough structure of the journal article. Now I'm just going to move into more details on all of those big 3 sections. So what is the Pacific Dream? This is a concept that I've introduced in my PhD thesis. The thesis looks at US alliances in a manner that relies less on international relations theory. I went with strategic culture because I think it better accommodates a more historical style of analysis, one which gives room to primary source research. The focus on path dependence, for example, is also very similar to the historical method. So it was this other detail about strategic culture that I found enticing. And given the research choice and the influence of historical analysis, I came across the possibility of defining an American vision for the Indo-Pacific. So it's a known fact that European integration has been something the US has pursued since the end of World War II. And it's also a well-known detail that America's plans for Asia were significantly less imposing due to a number of geopolitical complications. But the fact that the US gradually downgraded this vision for Asia does not mean that there was no vision at all. I've noticed that there have been some common trends in the speeches by key US political figures throughout the Cold War and the post-Cold War eras concerning how the Indo-Pacific should be shaped, governed, protected, how trade should unfold, and so on. Started with Dean Acheson and his famous perimeter speech, where he spoke of the 2 revulsions that countries in Asia would have. First of all, towards imperialism, and second of all, towards poverty. I then looked at Gerald Ford and his own Asia doctrine as a comparison. Both Acheson and Ford viewed America as an essential part of the Indo-Pacific's security and economic infrastructure. The main notable difference was that Ford was much more accommodating to the People's Republic of China than Acheson was, obviously. And the third comparison came from John Kerry when he was Obama's Secretary of State. I've used Kerry's speech in Tokyo in 2012, where he specifically uses the term Pacific Dream to articulate America's vision for the Indo-Pacific. A speech of its time of the 2010s, Kerry looked also at climate, human rights, and tried to move beyond economic networks, looking for a different form of integration. This structure from Atchison to Ford and Kerry allowed me to establish common trends in the US vision, the Pacific Dream, which served as the basis for my research. So I think that a reader of the journal article would find the notion of Pacific Dream interesting, but when I discuss American strategic views of the Indo-Pacific and alliance policy in general, it's impossible to do so without accounting for threats. So I'm gonna move on to the China section now. Is there a threat to America's plans? And if yes, how is it defined? What is it? For the Cold War, the threat was Soviet communism. The US was often rigid in its perception of Soviet communism. It believed to be very uniform across all communist countries, but above all, the threat of Soviet communism was ideological in nature. For my thesis and for the article's analysis, the threat is different. The threat is China. So my thesis, following the introduction and historical background chapters, is structured by presidency. I start with George Bush Jr., then I move on to Obama, to Trump, and I finish with Biden. In all these chapters, I've analyzed the US perception of China and how it has evolved over time, starting with the relatively rosy picture in the Bush years to the tension of the Trump and Biden years. China's different. It's a different kind of threat than Soviet communism. It's less ideological in some ways. It's ultimately a competitive country with an autocratic government structure. China, of course, had its own Chinese dream promoted during the early years of Xi Jinping. However, a close inspection of the Chinese dream will demonstrate that it has some similarities with the American dream of the 1950s until present. These notions of home ownership, disposable wealth, family values. But anyway, China's rise and evolution into a threat for the US has implications for the Pacific Dream. It becomes harder and harder for the US to argue for its vision for the Indo-Pacific now that there's a clear alternative to it. China's autocratic system also allows it to sometimes deceitfully present itself as a more stable, less troubled country than the US is. And the temptation for countries in Asia is thus big. There's a lot of hedging there. Here's where US allies come into play, as I argue in the thesis, that the Pacific Dream can only truly succeed if the US allows a greater safety its allies. And that's where we move to the San Francisco section. So I think so here's what I'm going to make the segue. The story of the San Francisco system is a fascinating one. I've noted in my thesis that while there are some good works on the hub and spoke system, as it's also known, particularly by Kim Harvey, it's a flaw of the literature that there aren't many more. The story of the San Francisco system is ultimately a story of democratization. And that begins in the early mid-1950s when the US signs all of those bilateral treaties. Two of its 5 members were dictatorships, South Korea and the Philippines, and the third, Thailand, was susceptible to repeated coups. Japan and Australia were the only stable democracies there, and there was a pronounced air of mistrust around Japan, not only from the countries that it oppressed during its fascist period, but also from Australia. And it's also why Australia and New Zealand were the only countries the US could reliably count on in the early Cold War years. And this is why ultimately early attempts to create NATO-like structures in Asia had failed. The only alliance group that resembled multilateralism was ANZUS, which is still ANZUS is the alliance of the US, Australia, and New Zealand. So to see this system evolve over the decades is fascinating. By the end of the 1980s, South Korea and the Philippines move away from their dictatorships, embracing democracy. Thailand's coups, they remained a common feature, but they were not as destabilizing as the US would think initially. The Americans kind of realized in the middle of the Cold War that Thailand's coups were palace coups and that they didn't ultimately threaten the alliance. Japan had transformed not only into a stable democracy with a perhaps too predictable electoral system, but also into an economic powerhouse, coming to challenge and scare the US in the 1980s. But by the end of the Cold War, the San Francisco system had become a group of stable democracies with flaws, but in a position to better align their norms and values with the US. I will argue, however, that the best days of the San Francisco system are behind it. Its loose bilateral structure is turning into its biggest flaw. The system itself comes across as a bit hierarchical too. Japan and Australia would form one group of their own in terms of how the US expects them to behave as allies, be it security alignment or diplomatic language or trade. South Korea is in the second category, a category by itself in some ways. It has a history of skepticism concerning the US alliance. Skepticism which is present in all San Francisco system members, but it's not that pronounced in Tokyo or Canberra. Ultimately, South Korea wants more independence. It wants to move away from the saying that has defined it over the centuries, that it's a shrimp among whales, the whales being historically China and Japan. But reasons of this study. We can also think of the US as a whale. And finally, there's the third group with the Philippines and Thailand. The US oftentimes views these two countries through the lens of Southeast Asia policy, tying them in more with ASEAN affairs, refraining from adding them to the bigger geopolitical picture. The coups in Thailand, even though repels coups, they make deeper integration harder, and the Philippines' downgrade of the security relationship with the US in 1992 remains one of the most striking setbacks for the San Francisco system. This fragmentation adds to the next point I'm making, that the San Francisco system is not the best suited mechanism for the implementation of the Pacific Dream. An analysis needs to be made of alternative structures. And here's where the Quad comes in on the next slide. So, is the Quad an answer to American problems? So the journal article has, to this far, an interesting structure, I would say. I have the notion of Pacific Dream or the examination of the San Francisco system, this argument that hub and spoke system is no longer fit for purpose. But I don't want to move on to the Quad. So much has been written about the Quad, but not so much about the San Francisco system Quad overlap or how the Quad's role in the US Pacific Dream alters it. So the point I'm making about the threats is quite important. The Quad failed in the late 2000s because there was an impression, shared by all members, that it was both becoming something which bothered China and something that was supposed to be an answer to a question people weren't asking. How do we counter the China threat? In the late 2000s, 2005, 6, 7, people simply were not asking that question. How do we counter the China threat? China was a country everyone back then wanted to work with. Since China wasn't viewed as a threat, there was an impression that the Quad was doing more bad than good. And it was thus abandoned in the 2007-2008 period. There's actually was a little bit of a diplomatic snafu between Kevin Rudd and his conservative prime minister before him, John Howard, because they kind of like started putting the blame on each other for who exactly forced abandoning the Quad as a concept decades later when it really became a thing. So a decade later, relations between China and India deteriorate, and they determined New Delhi to change its foreign policy course. Relations with Washington for India had been cordial since the Bush Jr. years, and that played perfectly into what was India's move away from its traditional non-aligned policy. Options for deeper cooperation with the US were explored. Japan joined in, Australia joined in as well. There was, by the end of the 2010s, the Quad was back, and this time it was answering a clearly defined threat, China. The way China spoke about the Quad had changed as well. At first, Beijing politicians were dismissive. Yang Jiechi described it as seafoam. But by the middle of the Biden administration, the rhetoric from Beijing to the Quad was very different. It was now defined as a bloc which threatens the stability of the Indo-Pacific. In a historical sense, this is exactly the way the Soviet Union defined it. What's striking is that for all these differences in style, persona, and ideology, and the way both Trump and Biden do politics, for different reasons, albeit, both of them choose to support the Quad. And that kind of would bring me to the final point of the presentation. It brings me back to that point of US strategic culture. How has it changed? Ultimately, the US wants to be the same Indo-Pacific power. It wants to write the rulebook for the Indo-Pacific, as Barack Obama would say. However, the manner in which it would do so has to change. The US has abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, its own trade deal for the Indo-Pacific, and it never managed to find something similar ever since. Questions need to be asked of US economic strategy for the Indo-Pacific. Is the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the new TPP? What about Quad Plus, the Quad's cousin, which is a looser, more trade-centric format? America needs to accommodate the views of its allies and take into account their ideas. It did so when the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific, known as FOI, put forward by Japan. It needs to continue to do so, and in some ways it is. There have been attempts to integrate the US and Japanese FOI with South Korea's new Southern policy, Seoul's own Indo-Pacific strategy, and with India's Act East policy, New Delhi's version of Indo-Pacific integration. I think the journal article raises good questions and has a structure which hopefully comes across as original, but the subject study is very contemporary, which can make analysis hard. That's a flaw I'm aware of. I'm also I stopped with a PhD as well in the middle of the Biden administration, 2022, because that was my cutoff point. So essentially I'm comparing Trump to half of a Biden term. I'm not very happy about that, but the cutoff for Biden is exactly after the national security strategy of the US, which was published in October 2022, and it's after the midterms. So I'm hoping I can kind of build an argument around that. And essentially the main gist would be that alliances are changing in the Indo-Pacific, and American allies have an increasingly greater say. And we're seeing the San Francisco system slowly getting replaced by the Quad. And we have these two very different administrations, Trump and Biden, expected to be very different, but even Trump and Biden welcomed the Quad. Biden took it further, but the Trump administration brought it about. Now, obviously, the reason for Trump's personal support for the Quad, I don't want to use harsh language, but I feel that Donald Trump was a little bit upset that he couldn't succeed in persuading China on matters of trade. So by the middle of the Trump administration, there was a very abrupt shift concerning China. That's when the US rhetoric towards the PRC becomes very Cold War style. So I believe that Trump, the president, as a political actor, welcomed the Quad because he simply wanted to argue for China on every imaginable front. But if we look beyond that, at an establishment level, if we look at the Department of Defense, the State Department, the National Security Council, and so on, the American foreign policy establishment, they welcomed this development, and it makes it a far more natural development than one would think. And these would be the main ideas of a journal article I'm drafting. It's taken from these two chapters from my PhD thesis. And yeah, that's roughly the presentation. So I'll move to the Q&A session.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and well done for not using harsh language in Donald Trump. I think that takes a lot of self-discipline. We have Patrick O'Dare, who is a first-year history PhD student at Queen's Mary University of London, under the supervision of a very good friend of mine, Professor Mark White. And he is researching the Watergate scandal in the American presidency, which is also the title of his paper. Thank you very much, and 15 minutes when you're ready.
Okay, let's go. So, on June 17th, 1972, 5 men were arrested attempting to break into the offices of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex. They were there sent by the Nixon re-election campaign in an attempt to try and sabotage the Democrats in the 1972 election. What do we think of when we think about Watergate? We think of break-ins, we think of burglaries, we think of dirty money and dirty tricks. I'm not a crook, to quote Richard Nixon. That's my favourite Nixon impression. I'm going to argue, and this links to the topic of my PhD, that's the wrong way to think about Watergate. We should think of it as a crisis, not a scandal. What do I mean by that? I mean, we should think of it as fundamentally a crisis over the nature of presidential power in the United States. This framing of crisis versus scandal is not mine. It's one that's been adopted by the sociologist Michael Schudson in his review of Watergate literature and the way in which different people think about Watergate differently. So we must think about Watergate in that context. So the powers of the presidency had been rising before Nixon came to office. Where to begin? I could start with the Constitutional Convention of 1787, but instead I'm going to start with the 1930s and the New Deal. The powers given to the FDR to deal with the crisis were referred to as fascist by one Republican senator. Comparisons to what was happening at the same time with Adolf Hitler and the Enabling Act were apt to conservatives, at least. Whereas previously, American political thinkers worried about Charles I storming into Parliament and seizing the powers of the legislature, now the concern was a Reichstag, voting to simply abandon its power to the executive. This continued after World War II, as Susan Mettler and Robert C. Lieberman calculate, between World War II and 1969, the executive branch doubled from 1.4 million to 2.9 million employees. Cold War, the Vietnam War, and continued to grow the presidential power. For example, in the Golden-Tonkin Resolution, Congress essentially gave the Johnson administration a blank check to run the Vietnam War. And of course, this had domestic implications as well. We think of the wiretapping of Martin Luther King under JFK. We think of the counterintelligence program under LBJ, a program of domestic surveillance of the Black Power movement and the anti-war movement. When Nixon came to power in 1969, then, he merely continued the set of trends that had already been established. He failed to enforce Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, declaring the suspension of funds for the school districts that continued not to desegregate their schools. He impounded congressionally allocated funds meaning they couldn't be spent on what Congress had allocated funds to be spent on. And most importantly, he expanded the war into Cambodia and secretly bombed Cambodia. So it was in this context that American liberals started to get a bitter taste in the mouth of the presidency that they had created. The obvious one, and I think some of you probably are thinking of this, is Arthur Schlesinger. But I think we can start actually in 1971 with George Reedy. Reedy had been the press secretary to the Johnson administration, and he had grown disillusioned with Johnson in the Vietnam War. He was afraid the presidency had become an isolated institution. He described it as an American monarchy. The president had too much power, was isolated from the real needs of the American people and from his own advisors, and he was concerned that bureaucracy was no longer an effective check on presidential power. He wrote, quote, "The trouble with the White House, for anyone who's a part of it, is that when the president picks up a telephone and tells people to do something, they usually do it." It wasn't just Reedy who was concerned. Congress was starting to grumble in the first Nixon administration. There was growing consensus by the early 1970s that there needed to be a Vietnam War withdrawal. There needed to be withdrawal from the Vietnam War. This consensus amongst the Democrats in Congress reflected the consensus amongst the country by and large by this point. As political scientist James L. Sundquist notes, Congress was attempting to reassert itself with the Case-Church Amendment, which effectively would have suspended the use of ground troops in Southeast Asia without congressional authorization. That failed, but by January 1973, a watered-down version of the amendment had passed, banning the use of ground troops in Cambodia. Where did the new Congress get this confidence from? After all, in 1972, with the Watergate scandal not being reported by anyone, with the notable exception of the Washington Post, Nixon had won an astonishing 49-state landslide with 61 or 2% of the vote. Don't quote me on that. However, the problem was he had failed to make any inroads in the permanent Democratic Congress. The permanent Democratic Congress was as permanently democratic as it ever was, despite this huge electoral college landslide in the presidential election. The new Congress was therefore surprisingly confident when it took power in January of 1973. Speaker Carl Albert asserted that Congress must stop the usurpation of power into the executive, while Democratic Senator Mike Mansfield also called for a reinforcement of, quote, checks and balances. By March of 1973, Congress had opened hearings on a new war powers bill, with one senator calling it a struggle between the Congress and the President, a constitutional crisis. What's my point? By the beginning of 1973, the atmosphere in Washington was ready for a fundamental rebalancing of constitutional power between Congress and the executive. And then came Watergate. By February, Congress had established the Senate Watergate Committee to investigate the affair. Watergate had been in the background. Now it exploded onto the front pages as a result of a cover-up failing. The man led to lead the Senate Watergate Committee was Senator Sam Ervin. Ervin was a Southern Democrat from North Carolina, and by and large, he was a character. For his part, Ervin had been a crusader on reasserting congressional influence over the federal government. He had been chairman of the subcommittee on the separation of powers. Before Watergate had even raised the issue to public consciousness, Ervin was railing against executive privilege in his subcommittee. Now the televised Watergate hearings, watched by massive audiences, beamed straight onto their television, allowed Ervin to transmit his crusade with Southern charm, folksy mannerisms, and a fondness for the odd Shakespearean quote. The Senate Watergate hearings, this is my big point. Everyone thinks of the Senate Watergate hearings as an investigative body. They remember Alexander Butterfield and the disclosure of the secret White House tapes, which were recording everything in the Oval Office. They remember the Vice Chairman Howard Baker asking that famous question, what did the president know and when did he know it? That's the wrong way to think of the Senate Watergate Committee. It should instead be thought of as constitutional dialogue. This is a phrase that the legal scholar Melvin Urofsky uses. It was constitutional dialogue transmitted into the homes of ordinary people in a way they could understand. Thus, The Watergate hearings will become the most exciting constitutional law lesson in American history. No wonder that Calvin Campbell, Irving's biographer, describes Irving as, quote, the last of the founding fathers. So where do we see this? I'll give you one example. Where do we see this dialogue in action? I'll give you the example of John Ehrlichman. I think it's the best. Ehrlichman had been the domestic counsel advisor to Nixon when Daniel Ellsberg, who died last week, coincidentally, leaked the Pentagon Papers revealing the truth about the lies the American government had told about the Vietnam War. The White House had responded, and you'll know this if you've seen the HBO series, establishing a White House plumbers unit, a vigilante squad in the White House that could get Daniel Ellsberg. To do this, Ehrlichman had authorized a break-in of Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in an attempt to get derogatory information. Appearing before the committee, Ehrlichman desperately had two arguments. One, which was the Bart Simpson's defense, I didn't do it. Two, which was the defense, even if I did do it, it was totally legal. The classic two-hit. He argued that Title 18 USC 2511, which prohibited the illegal interception of communications, gave the president to do so in a national security situation. Ehrlichman's lawyer, a man by the name of John Wilson, vigorously asserted this argument, pointing out that the statute expressly declared that nothing in this statute should be construed to interfere with the president's power to protect national security information against foreign intelligence activities. This was the argument. Therefore, the president had the right to burglarize the office. Irving responded against foreign, and I'll try and do the Southern accent, against foreign intelligence activities. Foreign intelligence activities had nothing to do with the opinion of Ellsberg's psychiatrist about his intellectual or emotional or psychological state. How do you know that, Mr. Chairman? Miss Ehrlichman asked aggressively. Because I can understand the English language. It's my mother tongue, Irving responded. And as he said this, you can find the video on YouTube. The audience just burst into applause. It was like a gladiator fight. This was a gladiator fight transmitted to millions of Americans. And by the way, we are talking about millions of Americans. 62 million, I think, was the highest number at one point. And what is this over? This is over pretty dense, complicated issues of constitutional law. But it's being done in a way that ordinary people can understand. Elsewhere, Ehrlichman argued that the president had the right to suspend the Fourth Amendment in national security cases. Irving, in turn, quoted directly from the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Adding, nowhere in this does it say the president has the right to suspend the Fourth Amendment. This was something ordinary people could understand. You didn't need to have a law degree to figure this out. Ehrlichman was the perfect villain for Irving's crusade. As British journalist Mary McCarthy wrote at the time, perhaps he cannot help his face, but he looks like somebody of a deeply criminal nature, a deformed personality. Philosopher Hannah Arendt is particularly repelled by Ehrlichman's arguments. National security now covers everything. I won't do a German accent, but I can't do a Southern accent. National security now covers everything, and it covers, as you know from the interrogation of Mr. Ehrlichman, all kinds of crimes. For instance, the president has a perfect right. The king can do no wrong. He is like a monarch in a republic. It was in this background by 1973 that Arthur Schlesinger, and I think some of you are going to be very familiar with this, published his famous work, The Imperial Presidency. Watergate was a product of the accumulation of power into the presidency, and there needed to be a rebalancing of power. This is the part that people ignore, however. If Schlesinger was writing to warn about the need to constrain the presidency, he was also advocating against those like Senator Irving, who wanted a more radical rebalance of power towards the Congress. The imperial presidency was in many respects a creation of liberalism's faith in the ability of the presidency to be a vehicle for progressive change, and liberals like James McGregor Burns, Theodore Sorensen, and Schlesinger were not about to abandon this now that the going had got tough. For example, Theodore Sorensen, a former aide in the Kennedy administration, argued that the problem wasn't the president had too much power. The problem was that he needed the same amount of power, but for the power to be made more accountable. And I'll leave it to you to decide whether that distinction makes any sense whatsoever. I want to now talk briefly about the Watergate reforms. We talk about the post-Watergate reforms, we should really talk about the Watergate reforms because many of them occurred during the Watergate period. Watergate, and this is how we think of Watergate. We think of it as this big argument, this big crisis for the presidency, and then after that, there is this concern about presidential power, and that's where we get the Watergate reforms. Completely wrong. Watergate was itself about presidential power. That was understood at the time. During this period then, in 1973, we have the War Powers Act. I'm not going to talk too much about that because it's not the focus of my PhD, but you can ask me questions at the end if you want. Effectively limiting the president's power abroad. Arguably, it didn't. However, it certainly made the president more accountable in the sense that he now had to report military operations to Congress. This was in direct response to the Cambodia bombing. Also passed was the impoundment, the Budget Control Act. This prevented impoundment. If Congress allocated $2 billion to fishing in the Mississippi, the president could no longer impound those funds and stop them from being spent. Not very sexy, very important. Why? Because it gives Congress the power of the purse, and it makes, and this links to what I'm doing in my PhD, it makes the bureaucracy accountable to Congress, because now it's the bureaucracy who have to go cap in hand to Congress, not the president. And finally, the Independent Counsel Act, the most famous and worst of them all. The Act was in direct response to the Saturday Night Massacre, where Nixon had fired the special prosecutor. The Act created a three-judge panel that appointed an independent prosecutor to investigate the executive branch. Therefore, it operated in a no-man's land between the executive and judicial branch, and plagued presidents for years, most famously with Lawrence Bush's Iran-Contra investigation and Ken Starr's investigation into the affair of Monica Lewinsky. What had begun as an attempt to restrain the presidency, therefore ended it with a semen-stained new dress. To conclude, what is the value, I think, of this work more broadly? It's to show the way in which constitutional dialogue can occur on a mass level, and also to demonstrate the need to understand Watergate as a crisis of presidential power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all panelists for coming in bang on time. Thank you very much. Open for questions. Any questions from the floor?
I have one for each one. On the sort of Indo-Pacific relationships, obviously we have no D50 DC at the moment, and I think the India-US relationship is a really interesting one, particularly given the role that India is playing with the war in Ukraine, as well as its, I would say, warming relations with China for various reasons. So how would you sort of look at India and consider India as a member of the Quad still, and despite the fact it's probably slightly less small to the US than the other members of the Quad, sort of more broadly speaking, do you see India as an outlier in that sense? Just how we frame that. Should I do all the questions?
Yeah, sure.
I'll do all the questions to give the other people time to think. Actually, on the membership of the subcommittee, does member ideology impact allocation? Also, sort of areas of sort of policy interest. I looked when you were speaking to see who the current chairman is, and it's Mario Diaz-Balart. So I'm sure his policy interests are very much driving his thinking on this. You can't talk to him about any policy area without going back to Cuba. So if he's on something which has aid relations, I'm sure that has some impact. And also, does the focus of allocation sort of shift with party control? Is there a sort of more security angles stance when we have Republicans in charge versus genuine aid when Democrats are in charge? Is that something that is actually visible, or is that just an assumption that could be made? And finally, on the Watergate sort of crisis versus scandal framing, you mentioned a lot of the sort of criticism from the sort of liberal democratic opposition, but obviously there was some internal Republican Party criticism as well. You mentioned the Case Church amendment, the Case Church is a Republican. So is the fact that there was a minority, but a loud minority within the Republican Party, which was also uncomfortable with the increase in presidential power under Nixon, what impact does that have on sort of framing of sort of crisis versus?
Yeah, so it comes back to that matter of how do I design the journal article, because the PhD thesis itself, every chapter has an India subsection. I deliberately, cynically excluded an India subsection for the journal article, trying to save words, because I was wondering if when I submit it to a journal, am I flooding the editors with just too many subpoints? So yeah, there's obviously a lot to say on the India angle. So I'm very happy that I started with Bush, with the first analytical chapter, because that's when the nature of the relationship changes. Until Bush, the US believed that India was flirting with being a rogue nuclear power. That changes under Bush when the idea very quickly becomes abandoned. And the consistency of the issue is actually quite striking, from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. For very different reasons, the US and India just get closer and closer. Now, again, it's that matter of differentiating Trump the politician and how do we compare him with Biden? Because Trump liked Modi because Modi fits into the strongman profile. His party, the BJP, engages in what's called Hindutva, which is a form of Hindu supremacy of sorts. It's very divisive. It has the support of a majority of people in India, but it creates a lot of tensions with the Muslim minority. But Modi catered enormously to Trump's political personality. And what comes to mind is the quite visually vulgar, to not use other words, Namaste Trump rally he organized in India, which was, I think it wasn't even in a proper city. It was in the middle of a field where they built the scene as to accommodate 80, 90, maybe 100,000 people. And I'm thinking about the speeches Trump gave there. And from Trump's perspective, it was India basically becoming a faithful ally of the US. Now, obviously, that's not true. Like you said, India has a very long history of close military ties with Russia. That goes back to the Cold War period. And yes, since the Ukraine war started, India, along with most of the global South countries, they have tried to avoid taking sides. So India is in a bit of a difficult position. But what's striking is that with Trump out and with Biden in, the US did not throw a temper tantrum over the issue. Normally, a more conservative, more hawkish administration would have a pretty big problem with the fact that India or other global South countries are not aligning with the US, especially given the Quad. But Biden, and I don't know if this is controversial, I personally think Biden's foreign policy team is one of the best in the US, probably the best ever, simply because he delegates so well authority. And the response from the US, I feel it was very measured. It was extremely aware of the fact that India is catering to its own national interests. And they just simply separated Quad topics from Russia topics in the line of the war. And that's consistent. And it plays into that point I'm making in the thesis and in the journal article that you need to make room for how US allies argue themselves. And we see this with Japan, we see this with South Korea, and we see it with India. It's this change in American strategic culture of simply making peace with the fact that the allies and the partners that you're dealing with have so much more agency. And yeah, those will be kind of my thoughts on it. Just another point on Modi courting Trump. It wasn't a unique thing. It's a very lucrative strategy with Trump. It's something Shinzo Abe did as well when he engaged in like Gulf diplomacy. He was, I think, the foreign leader which met most often with Trump, and he was one of the very first to go as far as visiting Trump in DC. And that's when he started those mini golf sessions. And it's basically catering to Trump's ego, and it's what got deterred from the Philippines and other paths. And yeah, when we look at Trump, we need to separate the foreign policy establishment from Trump, the political actor, because Trump, the political actor, can be very easily persuaded for short-term gains. So I'm sorry if that was a bit confusing, an amalgamation of answers, but those are my thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I think this is a natural and really interesting question about whether priorities seem to shift across kind of whether you have a Republican or a Democrat running the subcommittee. It seems to me like that should matter, and I've spent different kind of angles investigating it. So the kind of first approach is looking at whether things change in united and divided government, and there's not actually much evidence of that, which surprised me. And so I asked members of committee staff and also department officials, and that's kind of what they all say. There's actually not a dramatic shift that you would expect. I sort of thought too security assistance would increase under Republican chair. That doesn't seem to necessarily be the case. I think it matters. I think you can see it at kind of smaller level policy. And the other thing maybe to say is it's actually a really small number of people who are in charge in the House and the Senate subcommittee over the period I'm looking at. So like Nita Lowey and Kay Granger kind of trade off back and forth as chair and ranking member for a long block of that. Anita Louie is there for a long time. So actually, when you've only kind of got 4 people, chair and ranking member from the House and the Senate involved, I think they kind of know what each other's priorities are. And so the funding levels don't change that much. I think what the money is spent on does, but that's harder to pick up in the data. The interesting thing I have to work on at some point when I have time is I was able to pull from archives. A staff member had saved a sheet that tells me what every member of Congress requested to be put into the foreign aid budget. As kind of like, yeah, and not all the requests are approved, but I can see they get, I think, 6,000 requests every year for what people want in. And so I can kind of compare what are Republicans versus Democrats requesting. And yeah, how does that change? But yeah, surprisingly, it's not as obvious as I thought it would be.
Great question. You talk about Republicans. So there's a brilliant book on this if you want to know more by Matthew, I can't pronounce the last name, Matthew Concealwitz. Yeah, called They Said No to Nixon. And the book is about Republicans who said no to Nixon, who resisted him. I'm a little bit more skeptical. I think there's been, Adam Schiff, Democratic Senator, Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, in the impeachment hearings, he gave this speech where he said, where's Howard Baker? Where's Howard Baker? Referring to the Republican, I should have mentioned that, Republican vice chairman of the Senate Watergate committee. And it was this kind of great emotional time and everyone was crying, blah, blah, blah. Here's why I'm skeptical. Republicans really turned against Nixon, really in a sizable way. Towards the end, Baker, for example, was secretly recording, and I know this because I've listened to the tapes, he was secretly meeting with the Nixon administration, the White House, talking about the ways in which they could sabotage the Senate Watergate committee. It was actually the first time, I should have mentioned this too, the first time Baker really started to show he was starting to convert against Nixon was in his interrogation of John Ehrlichman. The arguments Ehrlichman made in the committee seemed to have really made Baker's stomach turn. But before that, Baker was completely on board the Nixon train, as was Senator Ed Gurney from Florida, who was Nixon's one of the strongest supporters in the on the committee. It was in the second term that Republicans started to get a little bit concerned with Nixon. One of the reasons is because I mentioned it before. Nixon wins 49 states. Virtually no inroads for Republicans in Congress. One of the reasons is because Nixon had not run as a Republican, but he had run as a Republican formally, but he hadn't really ran as a Republican. He had tried to be effectively an independent. He had a campaign called Democrats for Nixon, run by John Connolly, former Democratic governor of Texas, which encouraged, and it was really aimed at Southern Democrats, traditional Southern Democrats. Why don't you vote for me in 1972? Great, you can be a Democrat and vote for Nixon. But of course, that means you get a lot of ticket splitting. Also does not help out the RNC whatsoever at all during the 1972 election. All the money, all the dirty money is going into the committee to re-elect the president. None of it's going to the congressional races. And so it's after this, it's after November of 1972, that a lot of Republicans get really, really upset at Nixon. They feel like basically he's betrayed them because you won 49 states. Great. That's awesome. But you don't need that. And meanwhile, we had this chance to gain the House and the Senate, and we haven't. And so it was then when the political fortunes changed. Republicans started to get hold of the Nixon train. And then just regarding the question of presidential power more broadly, once Nixon, and this is something you see in the literature, once Nixon had been ousted from office, what Republicans are saying is not, as Irvin is saying, oh my God, this shows an imperial presidency. We really need to reform the system. What Republicans are saying is Nixon was corrupt. Watergate happened because of him, solely because of him, so they scapegoat him. He's the problem. But look, Nixon was forced to resign. This shows the system works. The system works. And if the system works, we don't need to have the huge type of reforms that people are talking about. So, for example, it's Republicans who are the ones who are very, very skeptical, in particular of the Independent Counsel Act. It's conservatives, especially during the 80s, who are really championing attacks on the Independent Counsel Act, both in the courts and in Congress. I'm thinking in the courts particularly of, I didn't have time to discuss this because it's probably, you probably don't want to hear about this, but you know, Antonin Scalia, his judicial opinions. So going back to the theme of your question, does that challenge, well, was Watergate maybe not as much of a crisis because you have Republicans who are willing to stand up to Nixon? I think that a lot of this, you know, the Matthew Cons, you know, the Adam Schiff of the world and the Matthew Consiors of the world, when they talk about how the heroism of the Republican Party against Nixon, what they're doing is they're comparing it to the Republican Party of today and its subservience to Donald Trump. And when you do that, yeah, you come out smelling like roses. But that's not really a great comparison. So that's yeah.
Thank you very much for three panelists for three really intriguing papers. Thank you very much.